Welcome back to the second reading guide for Design for Debate. In this talk, I'm going to cover part one of the book, Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds. If you recall, I said last week, or as you recall in the introduction, the book is structured in three parts. So part one addresses the notion of design, and that's what I'll talk about today. Part two, things, what are things? And part three is who is the designer, or what is the designer? So if you recall also from last talk, I said that if I really wanted to explore what post-humanist design might be, it didn't really make much sense to think about design in humanist terms. And by that, I mean the structure, the epistemological structure of design, what is known as design discipline. Now I offer up, and this is what we'll talk about, the idea of nomadic practice as an alternative to the idea of the discipline in design. So I'll explain later more about what I mean by epistemology. I know that's something we need to discuss. And what my concerns are with humanist disciplines, or the idea of design as a discipline. But before I do that, let's just take a step back and let me say what is the goal of this part, and that is to rethink the ways we structure the knowledge and the practices of designing with respect to post-humanism. So that's what I'm trying to do in these two chapters. So the alternative that I offer is, of course, nomadic practices. Now, what's a nomadic practice? Well, a nomadic practice is any practice that someone claims to be design. Now, I'm sure that might cause some concern, and I'll try to address what those concerns are. For example, really, anybody can claim to be design? Well, I'll talk about that. But what I want to focus now is what's the benefit of doing that. So I think this is counter to the understanding of design as a discipline. Design as a nomadic practice opens up the idea that there are multiple design practices at the same time. There's a multiplicity. That rather than there just being one singular understanding of design, maybe with various sub-disciplines that are organized hierarchically, but there can be many different ways in which we design. And so in that sense, it's expansive. And it's open up to thinking about current ways of designing that are equally valid as ways to design, but also new ways of designing that perhaps we don't think about as design. So in that way, it's expansive. It opens up the notion of to design to much more widely. And then the third, I think, benefit of nomadic practice is that it celebrates differences of design. And in fact, encourages this. So rather than sort of some level policing design into what is the truth of design, what is the singular best understanding of design, it actually abandons that idea and says, well, let's celebrate all the different ways in which we design, so differences. So I think the value of nomadic practice is its multiplicity, expansiveness, and differences. Now, one thing I'm able to do in this talk as a reading guide is actually work through the chapters, but somewhat backwards. So to go from chapters 3 to chapter 2, and actually start with examples of what I mean by different nomadic practices. And so here is a table, and I'm actually talking about going backwards, actually from chapter 8 in the book, the last chapter when I'm summarizing the book. And it summarizes 4 different nomadic practices that I describe in the book. In chapters 2 and 3, I focus on describing existing practices, so designing artifacts, designing objects, and designing products, and setting up, by having this epistemological structure, as we talked about, setting up the possibility, this is the expansiveness, for new ways of thinking about design, and this is the idea of designing things. Okay, so what do I mean by designing an artifact? What is an artifact, and why is that unique in terms of designing? Well, firstly, the example I have is a Fairphone. And I think many of you will be familiar with this, particularly since Fairphone has origins here in the Netherlands. And if you think about the designer and the thing that is designed, what's interesting about an artifact is that the Fairphone was conceptual. It was never actually a physical phone. It was a concept by someone background in business, someone a background in design, and they were really much more interested in raising critical awareness around ethical mining, the ethical use of minerals and metals in our phones. As the concept gained popularity and grew, and artifacts are interesting in that in many ways they are conceptual, or they and on one level, so they're really quite elastic, and then physically they go through various iterations and prototypes, and each one is really just a version of this ongoing progression toward really a complicated and progressive way of use, of human use. And in this case, that progressive notion is, yes, something that functions, but one that we can is sustainable. We're not going to throw it away. We can adapt it ourselves and change it. And it is ethically fair in the terms of maybe labor practices, the resources used, and so on. In some ways, the phone itself is actually not as important. And also what's interesting about artifacts is who the designer is this really a series of stakeholders that became designers in understanding understanding what the phone might be. So if we think about designing artifacts, what makes it distinct, the characteristics and the values that hold it together is the idea that artifacts contribute to human progress by supporting productive and complex use and practices. So really that's what the Fairphone is. It's human progress of use, ethical, sustainable, etc. Very complex, but also ultimately productive. It's functional. And as I talked about, it really has this temporal dimension to it, that an artifact can be both a prototype and what is actually designed at that moment to be used, and some future use, all of which can be the same artifact. So this brings me to the nomadic practice of designing objects. If you recall in chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, I quote at length Jony Ives. He's the former VP of design at Apple. And Ives recalls that when he was a 6-year-old and he saw his parents' bronze Citromatic juicer and what that experience was like. And of course the Citromatic juicer is designed by Dieter Rams. And he talks about how every line in the juicer was ideal. Every curve was perfect. That what resonated with him was the goodness, the quality, the sense that this was a good design object. Good design is what resonated with him. You know, he confesses, I mean, he's 6 years old, that he wasn't interested in juicing, and he had not experienced its functionality, or had not had the experience of use. He's not referring to that as you would with an artifact. He was simply talking about the object itself and looking at the object at what it embodied. He also says that after some 40 years, the Citromatic juicer still embodies and represents to him good design. So in that sense, it's timeless. It moves beyond the needs of the time. It moves beyond the values of the society at that time, that has an enduring quality. The other example I gave on designing objects was bronze portable radios. And in fact, when you think about a notion of a timeless sense of higher order of good, you almost think about like an art object. And sure enough, these photos of bronze portable radios are taken in a museum at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. But when you think about this, there is this sense of not only what is good design, but what is good, and so a kind of moral position, an appeal, an aspiration to something that is morally transcendent in the designing of an object, or having a greater sense of what is good, which also, I think resonates with us in examples of critical design and speculative design. This is an example by Mario Bellini called the Kara Sutra, and it was 1970, I believe. It's part of the Italian radical design movement. One of the first concept cars, but in fact it was really critical of the automotive industry. Critical of its consumerism, critical of it making mobility about getting from point A to point B, critical of the kind of violence and machismo that it seemed to promote, and really wanted to make that critique by through the designing of this object, through what the form itself could represent. And so the Kara Sutra, it's not a car that functions, but the fact that what it does is embodies what he sees as a better way of understanding life in motion, that is mobility, that inside the car was furniture that you can move around, that it would support a diversity of ways of living that were much healthier and much more in touch with what it is to be human. And this was his critique, and embodied through the object. And of course, again, this is not something you could experience or could use. You didn't need to. And so here you can see in this almost to kind of underscore to the sense that there is something different here that you need to pay attention to. You can see the way he photographed the Kara Sutra in this cornfield with mimes, and to create this sense that this is something different, that we need to do something different. So the idea of nomadic practice of designing objects is very different than designing artifacts. It holds a different sets of values. Objects represent cultural aspirations governed by transcendental principles of a higher order of morality and goodness. So these objects aim to be timeless and of a standard more enduring than social conventions or economic gains. So it's not that they're in opposition to artifacts, they're simply different than artifacts. So the last nomadic practice is the nomadic practice of designing products, and I really don't spend a lot of time talking about it in the book. I just sort of refer to it actually as part of the critique of Bellini's Kara Sutra. But in part, I mean, because the notion of products is something so prevalent to us now. It may have some qualities of use, it may have qualities of aesthetics, but ultimately, to design a product is to create market value. To create something that will represent some kind of fair exchange while also creating profit. Clearly, it's not about timelessness, as obsolescence is what it's about. You can see it in a product that, like the iPhone, that needs to be you need to buy a new one every 12 months or every 18 months. It may be about aesthetics, but really the aesthetics are really unchanging. They're not really progressing to anything new. It's maintaining a style rather than aesthetic, something again that has some market value. So what is unique about designing products is that products are capitalist means of increased production and economic development at industrial scale economies. So how do you produce something that contributes to the economy ultimately? And they aim to serve the human economic goals of fair transactions between profit and consumer satisfaction. So in that sense, products are very much situated in an economic world. Objects are very much situated in a aesthetic and moral world. And artifacts are situated in a functional utility world, but also one of human experience. So I think I described each of these three nomadic practices as distinct and different, and also I should point out that the designers in each of these are distinct and different. So the designer in the notion of the artifact, as I mentioned, was stakeholders. In objects, it's a known designer. It's Dieter Rams. It's the artist. The designer is celebrated. And in designing products, it's the corporation, it's ultimately the brand that's seen to be the designer. So not only is the thing different, but the designer is different. And it's the something that is different and the designer that is different. And it's this relationship between these two that make it unique. But what nomadic practice offers is a kind of practical, I think, advantage over the ideas of trying to pull all this together under a single discipline of design, which may have some sub-disciplines, but ultimately is connected together as one discipline. Often you have in thinking about you have this ongoing debates about what is design and what design should be. Is it really about creating market value? Is it really about the higher order of aesthetics and moral goodness? Is it really about satisfying and meeting user expectations and user needs and user experience? And these are ongoing battles. There are theoretical contradictions between them. which one do you draw on, and how they don't necessarily go together, that the idea of a higher aesthetic good and what you might draw on as a higher order of principles may compete with the notions of theories around market value. And on a practical level, there's confusion about what are the common skills between these. Do I need to have and knowledge? Do I need to have an understanding of business and market as you might have with products, or do I need to understand cognitive science and psychology as you may have with artifacts, or do I need to have an understanding of aesthetics and the history of design and art history as I made with objects? And this difference of understanding design in the practical sense of creating education, we know is distinct and different. We know that the program Industrial Design at TUE is very different than the program Industrial Design at Delft, which is yet again very different from the program at Simon Fraser University, where I also teach. These are three different ways of doing design, but each have their own claim to designing. And so if we view these as nomadic practices, we don't really get into a conflict over these. We don't get into these debates. We can accept the fact that there are practical differences between the very purposeful ways and distinctly purposeful ways we design different somethings. But in addition to the practical value, there's also a conceptual value that often is not there in thinking about designing. When you bring things together as a discipline, there's a certain internal diversity within a discipline, but there's still about maintaining the boundaries of the discipline and maintaining the shared foundation, even though the whole thing might move. And so what this is this expansiveness I talked about, the ability to have different, if you have to think about different ways of doing design. And this is really the practical necessity that I was after, was to try to find a new epistemological structure which was based in posthumanism, which would allow me to kind of think through designing things. But it doesn't need to stop at designing things. We could talk about all kinds of other ways of designing and open up to different practices of designing, such as designing public services, designing policy, designing decolonization, designing justice. Any number of different ways in which we can make a claim to design and design something that's very specific and requires a particular kind of designer in a particular situation, which may borrow from other ways of designing, but ultimately is its own practice. So I described what the benefits are of nomadic practice, and I gave you some examples of different nomadic practices, and then the possibility that we can start to think about other ways of designing, and I'll focus on designing things. And now I think we can sort of look a little more closely, and in particular look at the epistemological structure that nomadic practices are built on, and how that's distinct from a humanist structure, or humanist epistemological structure of disciplines. But let's understand nomadic practices a little bit more deeply, but first let me explain what I mean by epistemology. So episteme, which is knowledge, and epistemology is really the study of knowledge. But the way I like to think about it is it's really different theories on how we make knowledge, and how we know. And what is it? Why do we need theories on how we know? Well, I think we need to understand the methods by which we know. So the ways in which we know. We need to have some understanding of what is credible knowledge that's created. And also what are the limits, because we simply can't know everything. So that's really what epistemology is. And typically within epistemology there are underlying structures, and those structures could be conceptual, but they can also manifest themselves in things like curriculum and educational structures like universities, etc. So I mentioned at the beginning that nomadic practice is any claim to a practice of designing. But that's really just the definition, the bare minimum. The real question, of course, is, well, what is a strong claim, or what makes a good nomadic practice? And I describe this, and this is where I think is distinct from humanism, is to draw from three different post-humanist understandings or post-humanist theories to understand the qualities and characteristics of a nomadic practice. So I don't want to go too much in detail. A lot of it is in the book, but I just want to cover them to be sure we cover them and open this up for discussion in class. The first is intentionality, and this comes from phenomenology and post-phenomenology, and this speaks to the relationship between the designer and what is designed. That there is a co-shaping, there's a uniqueness. You have to look for this unique relationship between the two. How do they co-shape each other? So I talked about how in artifacts you have a series of stakeholders in designing a particular something, which is about human use. Different than design object, which is a higher set of principles by a single known designer. So intentionality is really important. It's that relationship. That's what makes a nomadic practice unique. That's really the place to start. The second is, I said anybody can make a claim about a nomadic practice, but I think we have to understand better the position of who's making the claim. Are they situated, or this notion of situated knowledge, which I take from Donna Haraway, this idea that she speaks about objective knowing is knowing when you are embodied in a situation, and you're identified as the person that's making the claim. That's very different than I think the kind of objectivity that we might talk about in a humanist discipline, where it's usually not something. It's actually usually disembodied, which she calls a God trick. We don't know who is saying that that this is true or not true. Or they make a claim to be disembodied as being all-seeing, and that's very different in nomadic practice, and fits very much with practices like designing, where I think they're very much an embodied sense. So we wanted someone who understands. If they're talking about designing policies, they have been designing policies. They're situated in that particular context. And then the last is nomadism, and this sort of and this I take from Deleuze and Guattari, and this idea that unlike disciplines, which tend to be territorial, and I've sort of commented on that throughout this talk, that they set up structures, they set up boundaries, they subdivide within the boundaries. There's a department of design, and there's a department of biology, and these are all very distinct. Nomadism is really about who gathers. So who gathers around any one practice, and that's what's important. And in fact, a strong practice is one where many gather around it. But also in this gathering, there is this this crossing of boundaries. So they're in place of a shared foundation. You can borrow from other practices, and I showed some of that in describing the sharing between, say, designing objects and designing products and designing artifacts. So I said I was going to, in this talk, work through, I guess, the chapters in reverse, from chapter 3 to chapter 2. And it's in chapter 2 that I point out that this notion of rethinking design discipline is not new. It's something that's an ongoing process, or an ongoing history. And I think it's in large part trying to overcome some of the limitations about the epistemological structures by which we understand design. So one part of this point of this chapter is to show that yes, discipline, this idea of the epistemological structure, how do we understand design, is something that is open to debate. The second thing I wanted to show is that the use of other epistemological theories that lead up to nomadic practice. And so nomadic practice doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so I want to, so to show partly where it comes from, where the thinking comes from, the underlying reasoning. And there are 3 different epistemological theories that I build on each other to arrive at nomadic practice. And I think they're important to think about. They're important for you to reflect on the fact that we need to be thinking about how we know in design and how we practice design, the methods by which we do it, the way in which we claim knowledge, and what are the limits in doing so. So the 3 epistemological theories that I talk about are Thomas Kuhn's paradigms, Johan Redström's programs, and Philip Agre's generative metaphors. So what is important about each of these in relation to nomadic practices, or how do they contribute to the idea of nomadic practices? Well, we begin with Kuhn's notion, which is commonly referred to as the paradigm shift. Came from his book Structure of Scientific Revolutions that was written in 1962. The main issue here is that Kuhn points out that disciplines or knowledge or science is not this ongoing, unbroken history of progression, but rather is disruptive. And you have whole shifts in science going from one understanding of the world, such as, say, Newtonian physics, to another, Maxwell's electromagnetism. And he calls this a paradigm shift. So the foundation and the assumptions built up under Newtonian physics do not necessarily apply to electromagnetic physics. And so knowledge is in that sense disruptive. And a good example of that is in a design-related discipline like HCI. It's what's known as the third wave HCI. And in third wave HCI was this argument that when what was known as second wave HCI, or became known as second wave HCI, that designing technologies was all about the workplace. It was about organizational structures, how people work, productivity, and tools to support work. However, as technologies went beyond the workplace, everything that was understood within second wave HCI became turned on its head, much like in the era we live in now, where we're focused on user experience, we're focused on design and emotions, and all of the things that we thought were assumptions in second wave HCI no longer hold in third wave HCI. So it's like a paradigm shift. And then there is the idea of program. I discussed this in chapter 2, taken from Johan Redstrom's Making Design Theory. And a program for Johan was the notion of how do we stay critical within the discipline of design? How do we stay critical about our assumptions or stay reflective on the assumptions? Don't simply take them for granted. So an example of this is slow technology, which actually originally was Lars Holmnes and Johan Redstrom's notion of here was a way of designing technologies that was critical of the idea that design should be about speed and convenience, but perhaps should be about slowness and reflection. And so this ability within the discipline to challenge some of the assumptions, not necessarily to override them, but just to keep a critical reflection and critical position and keep the discipline dynamic, so to speak. And thirdly, I talked about Philip Obgray's generative metaphors, which comes from his book Computation and Human Experience. And here, this idea was, in fact, Obgray argued that we don't even need foundations. This is, in some sense, the closest to nomadic practice. That he argued that in any given practice, there was a dominant mode, if you like, what he called a generative metaphor that drove what the practice was about. So we could talk about that as, say, use in human use in artifacts, for example. Or in this example by Daniela Rosner, which in her book Critical Fabulations from 2018, she sees that the dominant way of understanding design was a gendered notion, and that at the margins was a feminist understanding the contribution and the role of not just women, but feminism as a way to understand design. And so for Obgray, it was about thinking about how do we overturn the dominant metaphor, or the possibility that a dominant metaphor should be overturned by something at the margins. And to create a new metaphor for discipline, to rethink it in some sense, to even encourage this paradigm shift, but one in which there actually are no disciplinary foundations. So these three approaches, and I discussed them in details, of course, in the chapters, but this is just to give you a sense. I think that that the rethinking design is not something new. Nomadic practice is very much part of that constant reflection about how do we know in design, and then therefore how do we practice in design. And for you, what is it that how do you learn about design? And I think what nomadic practices bring to this tradition is the notion of post-human epistemologies, as I described. So a post-humanist understanding that takes us, opens up even more so away from humanist disciplines toward what I call nomadic practices. So this now brings us to what will be, this is the setup really for the remainder of the book, which is really an investigation of what is the nomadic practice of designing things.